Some people have been trying to address this. I was talking about this about 10 years ago, actually, about the problem of patent pools and how we do it. I'm told that you had a talk about the ILP vegetable system last year here, but maybe not. I'm not seeing people nodding. And here they've, a large number, you did? A little bit. Okay. What's happened is that a large number of companies have come together and said we will share patents between us under certain conditions, and we will agree a royalty to be paid by one company to the other. Once that royalty is agreed, all other companies in the group have access to that patented trait at the same royalty. So the first two companies will define a royalty, and after that, any of the other companies in the system will get the same right to use it at the same royalty. Some of them said, yeah, but we may not be able to agree, so there's a group of judges who decide what the royalty will be under what's called the baseball arbitration. You're asking 20%, you're asking 3%, so the arbitrators can only say 20 or 3. They can't say 10. They can only choose one, and that's in order to stop litigation. In fact, the group of arbitrators is meeting today in Amsterdam. I'm supposed to be there. But that was the way in which we tried to get something equivalent to that which has been used with mobile phones, when a Samsung can talk to an iPhone, can talk to a Y-phone, I don't know how to pronounce it, which then goes to the Chinese government. No, seriously, they had a system which they call FRAND, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms, in order to share technology for certain absolutely important patents. And that's what we started to talk about in relation to plants, because of the way in which farmers need the traits which are held by more than one company. The last point that I wanted to address, because I've been talking about it here in South Africa, is indigenous or traditional knowledge. Should the knowledge of communities living on the land be protected in the same way as patents are used to protect non-tangible property? That's an enormous topic which has been talked about in all sorts of fora, WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization, and so on, everywhere. And it's a difficult topic because we have to reconcile, I think, patent law and that which addresses traditional knowledge. The patent law assumes, and I started with this, a limited time for the protection, and the concept of knowledge as being an accretion. You build knowledge on knowledge. Indigenous knowledge law, or traditional knowledge law, says a group of people, a community, holds that knowledge forever. And they want to license it to other people to use, but that license, it says, implied, must be forever. More than that, they say the traditional knowledge is dynamic. It's changing all the time. So within the community, it's accretion. And the argument is that without the community, it should not be accretion. It should be fixed. How do you handle that? How do you sort that out? Furthermore, indigenous knowledge involves much more than just the use, say, of plant for medicinal purposes or food purposes. It involves ritual, it involves folklore, it involves music, and so on. So the use of that knowledge, A, is different within different communities and follows a different pattern, but based on the same material. And again we have a problem. So what did we in South Africa we sat down and tried to sort this out. A group was set up by the Department of Science and Technology here to look at these issues. One, what's a community? Is the Jewish community in Cape Town a community? I mean, we could sell chicken soup. It is. Is the traditional Indian community in Durban a community which has indigenous knowledge which is different from that found in India? And the answer, of course, is yes, because they developed over 100 years. There's more than one community. So community A, living in Stellenbosch, claims some knowledge, but the community B in Somerset West claims the same knowledge but slightly differently. How do we handle that? What we suggested, which is in the law, as far as I know, is that we should set up a system to provide a non-exclusive, non-transferable license to use the technology. Non-transferable is important, non-exclusive is important. The license would then provide for royalties for the same length of time as would have been available if it was a patent or a copyright, so 20 years, or 25 years, or 70 years in the case of copyright, after the death of the shaman or whatever. At the end of the time period, the license continues, but there's no further payments to be made. So the right to continue to use that particular bit of knowledge remains with the person who originally licensed it, but there's no further payments, which gives us the time limit, to some extent, that we'd have had with, say, a patent. Non-transferable means that if a company buys you out, the license doesn't go with the purchase. So you have to renegotiate the license. So each time a legal person wants a license, they have to renegotiate. Okay? So that gives the continuity and the time period that we wanted. And the last issue that we put in, the government may act as a broker between licensee and licensor where necessary, because, again, multiple communities may be claiming the rights over that particular knowledge. This was an ethical way to get round a major problem, and that's what we've tried to do. I've given you a brief insight into some of the issues that we've talked about when we're talking about ethics in agriculture. It's only an introduction. I could go on for the next month. I promise you I won't. But hopefully you can see the way, at least in Europe and in South Africa, we are thinking about some of these issues and trying to ensure that we get the food to the people where and when they want them. Thank you very much for your time.
100 people in the room who have questions and observations, so I would like to start. Found it super interesting. Gave us a good balance of opinions, and to most of the slides I could nod with my head. I would say, good, very good, like it. And I'm quite in favor of IP. Depends on my job. You started with one slide and with one statement which I would maybe like to challenge. You said many people around the world think that plants should not be patented.
Not me.
Isn't it really many people, or isn't it some NGOs who then manipulate the people and with one-sided information? I'm just a little bit provocative. And supported by press which uncritically just voice what the NGOs say.
Greenpeace and WWF get most of their funds from the European Commission in Europe. But leaving that aside, yes, you're right. But it's interesting that, I don't know how to put it, but it would appear that if you look at the Eurobarometer, which is a system where the European Commission has a public opinion poll, if I can put it in those terms, about many issues, and they've done a few on biotechnology over the last 30 years. And it is many people, at least in Europe. The difference between the United States and the European Union on this is the United States, the views of the people have been ignored because they get the same results in the public opinion polls as we get in Europe. So the government in the United States has led, and the governments in Europe have followed. And I'm putting that emotionally because I think Europe has been very, very wrong in the way they've handled this. So in the United States, they don't label. In Canada, they don't label transgenic organisms for the very good reason they say that where there is no harm, there's no need to label. In Europe, we said because people want to know, we should label. Okay? Very different perception of what should be done, and that's what's happened. So if you go into a European supermarket and look for a product which is a GMO, because those are the first ones that were ever patented, you won't find one. You just won't find it because the supermarkets won't stock it. Sorry. But otherwise we agree.
Other questions, points?
I have a whole list of questions.
Please do it.
Don't be shy. This is a unique opportunity. Anna?
No, thank you. Just to keep things rolling on. Julian, thank you very much for the provocative presentation to make us think. And you present a lot of information which I think surely you expect to be challenged, or I hope you would expect to be challenged. And you quote from the Bible quite early on in your presentation. And I think also it would be good in the future to actually have a few copies of The Emperor's New Clothes as well, and quote from that occasionally, because sometimes you have this wonderful juxtaposition. I don't know if you realize this, where you talked about the fears of industrialization of agriculture. And then in the next slide, you show how nonsensical that is.
Absolutely.
Because it's the complete opposite. You say, people say, yes, we must not industrialize agriculture because this will lead to food shortages, and then you flip the slide over and say, where are the food shortages? Oh, they're not where the industrialization has taken place. And we do exactly the same thing with that hunger map, and we do it with plant breeders' rights and seed certification. But how do you address this ridiculous claim? Because it's so demonstrably untrue. It's the emperor's new clothes. It's the only way to explain it. But how is it this never actually gets exposed? Why is the emperor still striding around bare naked and no one actually dares to point it out?
Thank you, Peter. Yes, I was very aware I was doing that and was deliberate. I almost say I would blame the media. And it's interesting because you, like I, will look at, say, Le Monde, and then look at the London Times, and then look at the Washington Post, taking 3 examples. And the Times in London is probably the premier newspaper in English-speaking world outside the United States, at least. It's terrible in covering science. Absolutely awful. Whereas Le Monde is not. And that becomes very interesting, because when you read Le Monde, or even this Süddeutsche Zeitung is another example. They actually give us a very clear, responsible commentary on what's happening. I've chosen both because the opposition to modern technology is strongest in France and Germany. And yet their newspapers are dealing with it properly. And in the UK they're not, and yet the opposition is less strong. So I don't know how to explain the answer. Again, I've done exactly the same thing of saying something and then reversing it. But I think it's important that we realize that these sorts of things are happening. Since President Trump was elected, we've got this new concept of fake news. Wherever, from whichever side.
It's a pity. Peter took away 2 of my points already, which I wanted to make. Noted it down here. I have it here. Undernourished people, look at the UPOF map. No UPOF member means hunger. So this is, and people in agriculture, EU has 3% in high-tech agriculture, and the GDP is high. India has 70% in subsistence farmers, GDP is low.
Yes.
So high-tech against subsistence, so okay. But I had another point. You said this South African farmer wants 2 traits.
No, that's an example.
Yeah, I just made this example, I copy it. So 2 traits, one drought resistance and one to use less pesticides. And you said, it happens that Monsanto had the one trait patented and Syngenta had the other as an example. I made the statement, without having a patent, these traits would not have been even invented. So the farmer would have nothing with a patent, without patents. He had not even have the choice, because Monsanto would not have paid millions to invent the one trait. Syngenta would not have put in $1 million to invent the second trait, so farmer had no choice. This
Absolutely.
is my side of the story.
Absolutely, but that wasn't the point. The point is where the traits are available, and I want them to be available. I've got nothing against patents, by the way. Please, if I gave the impression that I think patents are wrong, I hope I didn't. It's how we get what farmers want to them is what I'm concerned about. And if we have a patent system which blocks off patents because certain organizations hold them and not the other, then we've got a problem. That's the problem I was trying to identify. And what we want to do is to allow the sharing of those patents. I hope that's the point. So, yes, you're absolutely right. There are many who argue, there's a IP lawyer called Richard Gold at McGill, who argues particularly in the area of medicine that the patent system is actually counterproductive. But that's not the argument I was trying to make here. But if you want to see arguments about that, I can give you papers by Richard which explain why it's counterproductive. It's not one I make.
It seemed interesting to me that the first half of the afternoon we were talking about the ethics of the environment and what we owe the natural world, or what an ethical stance toward the natural world would be. Your presentation, equally interesting, seems to be very human-centric. I saw nothing about the environment here, and it had to be by choice. I wonder, I mean, maybe you weren't trying to create the grand theory of everything, but did you intentionally leave out the environment? Are these two things, can they not be squared, or do you just wanted to bite off what you bit off?
As I said, I could have spent a month. I didn't intentionally leave out the environment. And please read that document the EGE produced. The issue, we tried to identify, when we were working on this quite a while ago, a number of things. We talked about the natural environment. Europe doesn't have much of that. We talked about the agricultural environment and commerce. In this talk, because we were talking about patent in agriculture, I deliberately thought about the agricultural environment. Now, are we harming the natural environment because of the way we're using agriculture? The answer is, of course, yes. And you can see what Bolsonaro is doing already in the few weeks he's been president of Brazil in relation to the release of land in the Amazon for agricultural, particularly for agricultural purposes. And what the implications are of that are really very great concern. So it was a deliberate choice given